Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. I'm Amber Mitchell, Public Engagement and Community Programs Coordinator here at the National WWII Museum. I want to thank each and every one of you today for joining us for our Lunchbox Lecture. As most of you here in this room know, these lectures happen every first and third Wednesday of every month. And today we are super excited because the former coordinator of this program is actually leading a discussion, so that will be fun. And I expect our usuals in the front to give them all kinds of a hard time. So before we get started today, for those of you in the room, please go ahead and silence those cell phones for me, just so that we show our proper respect to our speaker today. A few upcoming events to add to your calendar and be aware of here at the museum. In 2 weeks, on Wednesday, October 3rd, we have our Keep Smiling Comedy Night with Funny Bones Improv here at the museum. That is a free event, but we do ask that folks register in advance for that online at our website. It is part of our Bob and Dolores Hope Foundation grant as part of our Bob Hope programs. So please do come out for that. Next, we have our Air, Sea, and Land Festival, our big air show happening out at Lakefront Airport on October 12th through the 14th. That's a weekend, so Friday through Sunday. That is a paid event. However, on that Friday, October 12th, is our Free Student Friday. So if you have any young ones who are interested in airplanes or just want to get out of school for the day, make sure to bring them on out on October 12th to Lakefront Airport for the Air, Sea, and Land Festival. So today's presentation is streaming live on Facebook and will be available for viewing in its entirety on the museum's Facebook page, which of course is facebook.com/WWII Museum, and then later on the museum's YouTube channel. So please feel free to share those live streams with any of your Facebook buddies who might be interested. And if you're joining us live tonight, this afternoon, it's not nighttime yet, I still have a few hours. If you're joining us live right now from Facebook, thank you for joining us. And you are welcome to offer a question to our speaker in the comments section, and we'll get to that at the end of the presentation. So now that all of my housekeeping is out the way, I'm going to turn it over to today's speaker, who is Mr. Adam Foreman, who is the Student Program Specialist here at the National WWII Museum.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay?
Sure.
Great. I love these new microphones.
Yeah.
They much better than what we were operating with a few months ago. So I'm super excited to be here. I studied race and capitalism in graduate school. And that's one of those topics that you just kind of study solid for several years and then just file away and never get the opportunity to talk about again, because it's a typical grad student rabbit hole is what we call them. But the one thing that I learned that I really want to share with you all here today is that race is far more complex than just the color of someone's skin. In fact, racial lines have been drawn and redrawn all through brevity. We're going to keep our conversation to the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And the first thing that I want to point out is societies have redefined racial boundaries using all the same techniques all throughout history. And here they are. First, they changed and directed social dialogue. Secondly, they codified those beliefs into laws. And third, they justified those beliefs and laws. This is how societies define races. This is how societies define the other, because that's essentially what we're talking about. So what I really want you to pay attention to is how these three techniques have been applied in every case study that we're going to look at. Additionally, I want you to notice how closely related American racial history is to the racist policies of both the Nazi and American governments during World War II. So bear with me, because to understand the racial dynamics of World War II, you have to first understand the racialized society that was built in the United States. And the foundation of that society begins in 1619, whenever the Dutch brought the first captured Africans to America. This sows a seed for a new economic system that perseveres for nearly 300 years in the Americas. And by the second half of the 17th century, indentured servants in America, by the second half of the 17th century, indentured servants on the American continent gives way to a race-based slave system. One where black equaled slave, non-black equaled non-slave. This racialized system for the first time in history is codified by black codes or code noir. And the earliest of these codes dealt with concerns over religion, chattel ownership, and even children of masters and enslaved women. And white owners having children with their enslaved women, as you can tell, brought up a whole different set of issues. One that forced American society to redefine racial lines yet again. Given names like mulatto and Creoles of color, this population of mixed-race people spawned new legislation, like the one-drop rule. In fact, the word itself, mulatto, comes from an old Spanish word, mula, which is meaning mule, the offspring of a horse and a donkey. Mulatto and Creoles of color populations often lived in an ambiguous space somewhere between slavery and freedom. And the angst of this space is best immortalized by Kate Chopin's fictional story, Desiree's Baby. A story where a mother's child is born with darker skin, and the mother experiences this overwhelming anxiety, questioning her own racial status and her own identity. Spoiler alert, by the end of the story, the reader learns that Desiree's husband is the one who's actually biracial, but he's light-skinned enough to pass as white. So American propaganda depicting and defining blackness emerges almost immediately. So here are just a couple of examples. The first is an example of a political propaganda poster in 1860, arguably one of the most racially charged political campaigns in American history. You can see that it's pretty straightforward. They don't try to hide anything, right? So Democratic Party platform is an image of a typical white male. The Republican Party platform is this is a very exaggerated version of an African American. This is 1860. Who was elected in 1860? This is Lincoln's election, right? So the political system at the time is defining the other, defining who the enemy is. Now, this political ad was probably found in the South. That can be a pretty fair assumption. So it's playing to the base. It's playing to the arguments of those around them. Next to it is a depiction of Jim Crow. Now, this is a white actor named Thomas Rice who played a black enslaved man who skipped work, got into mischief, a character that would rather play around and be foolish than work. This type of visual arts is a very effective form of propaganda. Think of modern films that depict exaggerated characters. Okay, this is the same type of thing. We're going to look at some Nazi films later on where they used a lot of the same techniques. Okay, so if you notice how Jim Crow is standing, he's very whimsical. He has tattered clothing. He's smiling. Again, this is a white actor in blackface. What the character Jim Crow does is it plays on the fears, white fears of those enslaved. By the 1850s, a new science begins to emerge. And one of its founders, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, publishes his findings for what he considers to be scientific proof of African racial inferiority. He discovered a new mental illness called drapetomania, where he surmised that Africans who try to escape enslavement are actually suffering from some form of madness. Other eugenic and polygenic doctors like Josiah Nott published graphs and scientific findings that include methods of phrenology, which is the measure of skulls and the measure of the human body, physical features of of those with African descent, and it often included really brutal human experiments. Okay, so as you can see, this is a publication from Josiah Nott. The typical Greek white figure here, the individual with African descent, and then an ape. You can see that the bulging mandibles and the flatter face here. He compares apes to those enslaved several times. He compares native Africans to those closest to apes. So he is using science and biology to attempt to justify this idea of a completely separate other, right? So we see the racial lines redrawn again in the 1840s and 50s with the diaspora of over 5 million Irish to the United States. These immigrants often found themselves competing for manual labor in shipyards, railroads, and canal construction jobs. And in response, United States society developed an ethnic hierarchy that defined whiteness. So to codify that ethnic hierarchy, Congress passed new immigration acts that limited Irish and other undesirable immigrants, and those who did arrive in the United States faced really fierce discrimination based on this newly defined Irish race. The Irish settled into a really weird space. They were too white to be black, but not white enough to be Anglo-European. Okay. This is the cover of Harper's Weekly. This is 1876, and you notice that it's a pretty clear image. It's on the scales of society, right, with South being one side, North being the other. The lowest rung of society, that being blacks in the South and Irish in the North, and they're equal. Okay. The others are, we've all heard that there's always been this campy saying Irish need not apply. Well, that was a real thing. So these are just some of the advertisements that I found, employment advertisements in various newspapers that stated. So this pushes the Irish to take menial jobs, take very, very intense labor jobs. During this same period, here we go. So science attempts to also categorize the Irish, claiming that they're more closely related to those of African descent. So again, we see drawings and we see graphs attempting to justify the claims of a separate Irish race. Okay, so we see an Irishman, an Anglo here, and then an African descent with the same similar features, with the prominent noses, the bulging mouths there, of course with the Anglo descent being more flat-faced. All right. So the cool thing that I found here is Irish-Iberian, which Iberian Peninsula is Spain and Portugal. And the reason they call them Irish-Iberians and not Hibernians is because the whole justification behind this science is that the Irish that came over to the United States were actually descendants of mixed race peoples of African and Spanish descent, which is a weird way to try to justify this. So during the same period, the American political system saw a rise of political parties battling over racial policy. And parties like the Southern Democrats, the anti-immigrant and white supremacist Know Nothing Party, the Free Soil Party, who opposed expansion of slavery west, but still supported and promoted the ideas of racial inferiority. Those more radical parties never gained a majority of power in government, so their policies were never really implemented. However, they often controlled public narratives surrounding race. And between 1850 and 1852, the United States saw yet another 1850 and 1882, the United States saw another large influx of non-white immigrants. These were the Chinese, and they suffered a similar story to that of the Irish. In fact, the comparisons were not lost on those people living in that time. This image is called The Great Fear of the Period, and you see an Irish immigrant and a Chinese immigrant devouring Uncle Sam at the top, and then continue to devour him in the bottom third, and then eventually the Chinese immigrant devouring the Irish immigrant in the bottom third. This is just, the neat thing that I really want to point out is that these lines back here, that's the expansions of railroads. Okay, so they're talking about heavy labor jobs such as railroad construction being the demise of American society, is what this image is telling us. Yeah.
Where can we put the blame or the concept, or I can't use the word credit, that it's okay to bring in people to do jobs that we don't want to do? Is that a doctrine itself, or who is they? Who is pushing this? Even today you see it where, well, we'll hire these people to do work we don't want to do.
Right.
Where does that concept come from?
It's one that has been in American psyche since the beginning of American society. I mean, it's a concept of this idea of this concept is that not that the labor was too difficult or that we didn't want to do it, but that there was so much labor available because we're building railroads, we're building canals, we're building gold mines after the gold rush. There's so much jobs, there's so many jobs available that it is attracting people from overseas. And of course there are lots of other reasons why people immigrate from countries. The Irish being the famines that struck those areas, the Chinese being political persecution, and the Chinese, even more importantly, American, I'm getting off the topic here, but the American businessmen actually went over to China to recruit Chinese immigrants to work in gold mines. That's how the Chinese immigration really started. So it wasn't really, in this particular time period, with the Chinese immigration, the Irish immigration, it wasn't that we were hoping that someone would come over and do the jobs. It was that the jobs were available and these people came over for them, if that makes sense. It doesn't. Okay.
I do remember I just shared a story about the Irish, and I'm not from here, I'm sure the local people know this, but when they were digging the canal from Bob St. John, the plantation owners would not let the slaves work there because it was a death sentence.
Yeah.
And the Irish, they could hire them for a nickel a day off the boat. I think there's like 10,000 graves somewhere just Irish.
Right. Yeah, and that story plays directly into this idea of racial inferiority, the idea that the Irish were not white, so they are expendable. Right. That's exactly where that story plays in, and that fits really well with this conversation. This is just one example of how economic competition and of course religious difference drives really xenophobic ideas. And in 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act that completely ended Chinese immigration. Later legislation further alienated Chinese by prohibiting naturalized citizenship, property ownership, and legally identified the Chinese as a race that was unable to assimilate into American society. Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote that the Chinese was a race so different from our own that we do not permit those belonging to it to become citizens of the United States. Persons belonging to it, with few exceptions, are absolutely excluded from our country. And this is during the Plessy versus Ferguson dissent. This is where he wrote that. Okay, so he is, at the highest court of our land, he is justifying the complete exclusion of Chinese immigrants from American society, simply because they are Chinese. Okay? So the propaganda around that time is really, really interesting. The Chinese settlements along the West Coast and Western railroad towns become known as the Yellow Peril. And the political cartoons support that belief at the time. So here, let's just take a gander at these. This one's from 1899, so a little bit after the little period that we're talking about here. Well, my laser pointer has died. So you notice this typically Chinese-looking man with a long braid, which is a typical Chinese hairstyle, stepping over a slaughtered white woman. Who do you think the slaughtered white woman is supposed to represent?
Liberty.
The United States, Colombia, right? Colombia was a very popular notion in propaganda at the time. So she is supposed to represent Colombia, or she's supposed to represent Western white settlements. But essentially this notion of the American spirit, right? This notion of America. So this one here is, again, Colombia protecting an embattled Chinese immigrant. Again, you're going to notice in all of this propaganda that the features are exaggerated, so deeply slanted eyes, tiny face figures, bald head, a long braid, wearing wooden shoes, all in front of some really harsh criticism. So importation of Chinese barbarians, vicious, immoral, heathenish, so really, really harsh criticisms of Chinese workers in the time. So this propaganda was very effective at changing social narratives around the Chinese immigration. So effective, in fact, that the United States government ended all Chinese immigration. So it's a really powerful notion. So the trends of racial history of the 20th century often closely parallel those to the 18th and 19th centuries. And many of the racist policies of both the Nazi German government and the United States government have roots that run deeply through these three major diasporas that we've been talking about. So you'll see propaganda become much more sophisticated. You'll see legislation become more radicalized. But you'll notice that all of it has the same three basic techniques used in the previous centuries that were also used again during World War II. In fact, I'm willing to bet that while I've been talking, you've already made some connections between Nazi policy and the things that we have already seen in the American racial past. I'm willing to bet that you've already done that. Okay? So as early as 1919, Hitler writes some of the first comments on the Jewish question. In the statement, he defined Jews as a race, not as a religious community. He went on to describe the effect of Jews living among non-Jews as a racial tuberculosis of the people. And tuberculosis, of course, is a very deadly disease. And when Hitler joins the German Workers' Party, he declares that the ultimate goal of the German government should be the removal of Jews from society altogether. Just as we've seen with African Americans and Irish and Chinese in the United States, the Nazi Party in Germany uses rhetoric, propaganda, and legislation to define the Jewish people as an inescapably separate race and a source of all social and economic problems. So I want to be very, very clear in saying that anti-Semitism did not begin with Nazi Germany. Okay? I want to make that very clear. That's not the thesis that I'm proposing. What I am saying is that this is one of the first times in history that we see the Jewish people defined as a completely separate race. Something that runs in the blood. Something that you cannot convert from. Okay? So what the Nazi Party does, starting in 1919, is begin to redraw the racial boundaries that completely segregate the Jewish people from Germans. So we all know that the Nazis were masters at propaganda. They weaponized images and performances to define who their enemies were. Again, this propaganda, you notice, exaggerates physical features. It directly defines who the source of problems are. And in these first two images, you see robust people, robust figures with large hook noses. And this poster even says he is the cause of war. So he is the reason for war. So it is directly saying that the Jewish population is the reason World War II began. Okay, so they're not being very subtle about this. Okay, but you notice the large nose, you notice the large ears, you notice that most depictions of Jewish people are going to be larger. They're going to be more fat, essentially. And that's because the Jewish people made up most of your business people. They made up your bankers. They made up your wealthier class of folks. Right? You notice on the other one, again, the large, very large hook nose, short stubbly chin, very large ears. These are depictions that you're going to see over and over and over again of Jewish people. All right? So they're exaggerating prominent features of Jewish people. So Nazis understood, if you remember, we just saw a similar image of the Irish immigrant and the Chinese immigrant consuming Uncle Sam, right? Well, this is a Jewish person consuming a communist, consuming Uncle Sam, consuming a lion, which is, of course, supposed to be the British Empire, right? So it's the very same idea of this idea of consumption and dominance that starts with the Jewish people that's being portrayed here. So what this is telling us is that the Jews are really behind the war. Again, it's defining who your enemy is. So this is an idea of dominance. This is exactly what this is. It's exactly what the other image was complete social dominance. And this idea of consuming your enemies or consuming those who are working with you is an old idea that dates back to the image that we just saw, right? You often see propaganda attribute beast-like features to enemies. So here the Jewish race is spread among the world like a spider. You notice again, there's no Jewish star on this particular image, but you know that he's Jewish because of the large hook nose, the very large ears, the big eyes, the tentacle-like hands of the spider encompassing the world. These are very, very powerful images that spoke closely to the German people. So we see lots of examples of American propaganda attributing beast-like qualities to the Japanese, which we'll get to in a bit here. The Nazis also understood the extraordinary power of performances in films. The Eternal Jew claimed to be a documentary, and it showed Jewish rituals in some of the most brutal and barbaric light that had ever been displayed at the time. Even today, it's considered awful. It's a horrible, horrible film. If you've ever seen it, it's a dreadful film. But it shows the Jewish faith slaughtering cattle, slaughtering baby cows, and it's really a nasty, nasty film. It became very unpopular in even Germany. Yeah, I think that was the line that they had drawn, that they didn't want to see baby cows get slaughtered. But Seuss was much more popular, and this is an old story, but it's a story about about a villain who is a Jewish outsider who rises to the power in this particular community, and he goes on to rape a German woman and steals money and becomes the source of problems in that community, and he's executed at the end of the film. But if you recall the character of Jim Crow, it's a lot of that same stuff. They're exaggerating social and economic conditions of their enemy. So the image of Jim Crow was powerful enough that we named a whole violent era of American history after it. That's how powerful these performances were. That's how these films during Nazi Germany, or in Nazi Germany, changed the whole conversation around Jewish people, because thousands of people were seeing these films, right? Some of the most troubling propaganda that the Nazis produced was propaganda aimed at children. We're only going to very briefly discuss this because there was I think last year, a lunchbox lecture only on propaganda aimed at children. So we're not going to waste a lot of time on this. But again, you notice a large hooked nose, large-eared man tempting a German woman with a trinket and has a weird smile on his face, so he's clearly up to something sinister. The next image is from a children's textbook that is a depiction of the race education classes that were started in Nazi Germany. And I actually have an image of one of those classes here. This is 1935, a race education class. These classes were established as a part of the laws that established the new racial lines in Nazi Germany. Okay? One of the laws required schools, German schools, to teach race education. And this is one of those classes there. So they're pointing out physical features that can tell you how to spot a Jew. That's what they're doing. Okay? Tell you how to identify who your enemy is. So the most powerful of the legal codes passed in Nazi Germany were, of course, called the Nuremberg Laws. Now, these are very similar to the Black Codes and the Code Noir single drop laws that happen in the United States. The Nuremberg Laws are known for defining racial purity and dictating what legal marriages of different races mean and what they look like. Additional legislation that are kind of lumped into Nuremberg Laws as well led to the removal of Jewish people from German society completely. Jewish-owned businesses were targeted and closed. Jewish neighborhoods were ransacked, and relocation of entire populations created the most deadly diaspora of European Jews, of which 6 million lives were stolen. So the Holocaust and the Nazis' final solution marks the most extreme racial policy that we're going to talk about. It can't be compared in size or in scope to any other ethnic genocide in human history. However, the final step in redrawing racial lines is to justify those beliefs. Just as we've seen in the American racial past, Nazi Germany used eugenics and phrenology to justify their laws and claims of the existence of a separate Jewish race. Nazis set out to measure every bit of the Jewish body. This idea of a fundamental biological difference, we already know, is nothing new. This has been going on since the establishment of races in the Americas. But Nazi doctors and scientists took it a step further, and they forced prisoners into very brutal human experiments. There were some experiments that they even subjected Jewish prisoners to deep freeze conditions to see how long their bodies would last. I mean, that's how brutal these ideas were. All of which, of course, are a result of radical government policies. So while the Jewish faith was being transformed into a racial identity all across Europe, the United States used very similar strategies to define their enemy, Japan. Japanese immigration to the United States was on a much smaller scale, and it began with about 30,000 immigrants to Hawaii to work on sugar plantations around 1885. But after the Chinese Exclusion Acts in the 1880s, Japanese immigrants began moving to the West Coast to fill those very same jobs that were once held by the large influx of Chinese. Japanese immigrants faced much of the same discrimination. Communities refused to sell land to Japanese immigrants, and they were often forced to the periphery of those societies. Okay, so that's why we have whole communities of, that's why we have Chinatowns, and that's why we have whole communities of Chinese people living together. That's why we have whole communities of Japanese people living together. Because either A, it was illegal for them to own property, or B, the white citizens of those communities refused to sell property to those immigrants. So, unlike the racial tensions of the past, which responded to economic or even religious pressures, racial boundaries in the United States during World War II were really forcibly redrawn out of what was considered wartime necessity. So just as we've seen before, anti-Japanese prejudice of World War II was sharply reflected in American propaganda. They used images with exaggerated physical features. Americans became very good at presenting beastly or supernatural attributes to their enemies, and it designates the newly defined Japanese race as inferior and subhuman. Some of these images even depict the Japanese as physically smaller, like this one. So this is a very stout, very, very short Japanese man standing up to a very large Uncle Sam. And of course, Uncle Sam is slapping him, is what he's doing. But if you notice the big teeth, the very, very small, very squinty eyes, in this image, you notice the broken English, you notice the very large teeth, you notice the large pointy ears, the beast-like claws that are coming out of his fingers here. So they attributed, the Americans got very good at attributing beast-like attributes to their enemies. And we're going to see some more here in just a minute. So here is some more. So we see fangs like a vampire, ears like a vampire. You notice the blood dripping off of his dagger. Again, broken English. The other one is Japan depicted as a snake, or a Japanese person depicted as a snake with the very close eyes, very squinty. The American government capitalized on the fears of the people after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And that was Executive Order 9066, signed February 19th, 1942, where the president authorized the relocation and incarceration of tens of thousands of Japanese or American citizens of Japanese ancestry. While it's true that 9066 was later applied to much smaller numbers of German and Italian citizens with those ascents, it had a really significant impact on the Japanese communities, often uprooting entire neighborhoods and relocating them. This first image is kind of a fun one from Dr. Seuss. It's completely made up, of course, but you notice California and Oregon and Washington with all of its Japanese ancestry lining up to get TNT from their Japanese counterparts. And this guy is waiting for the signal. He's got his periscope out looking for a signal from the home islands to begin attacking the United States mainland from the inside. These are the types of fears that were capitalized on to be able to pass or to be able to implement such a radical idea as relocation of an entire Japanese population. Yeah.
You're doing an excellent job. I didn't realize all that. I want to compliment you. What is the role like of the church? I don't want to get off the topic, but is the church just like being quiet, or there's so many churches they like the Indians, nobody's united?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't consider talking too much about American religion in this lecture. I think that would bring us down a much longer road. What we can say is that the Catholic Church didn't do very much in Europe to help stop the persecution of Jewish people. We know that the Pope was, no, I shouldn't say that. He wasn't he sat idly while Nazi and Italian Jews were relocated themselves during the Holocaust. So I don't know about the role of American churches. I do know that American churches led the way for Chinese and Japanese reconstruction, both during and after the war. American churches often sent missions and goods to China specifically. So as far as their role in this, I'm unsure of. Excuse me. Let's see. So as a part of this new legal wartime action that the United States was taking, Japanese American businesses were closed and vandalized. It's a very similar story to those Jewish businesses in Europe. And it resulted in a complete exclusion of Japanese ancestry or Japanese Americans from American society. So these images should really bring back the memory of not too long ago whenever we were just talking about the Jewish exclusion from German society. But this one in particular is a really great one that I found doing this research, surprisingly. This is a barber on the West Coast, and he has a sign above his cash register that says, "We don't want any Japs back here ever." And it is exactly like the Jewish signs that we saw in Europe. It is exactly like the Irish need not apply signs that we saw in early American history. So it seems that the playbook is almost identical across history. So the United States goes even farther, and it employs a type of pseudo-eugenics system that by now should be very familiar, called How to Spotted Jap. These charts are published in soldier handbooks, and they define the differences between a Chinese and a Japanese person. So you see the C is Chinese, a J is a Japanese person. You notice that the white man is taller than both of them to start with. So this is the same thing as those three skulls next to each other, right? So an American white man, a Chinese man, and a Japanese man. The American is taller. The Chinese man is a little bit taller than the Japanese. The Japanese is the shortest. The fun thing about this is that they describe the color. So Chinese is a dull bronzing color, while Japanese is lighter, more on the lemon yellow side is what they described it. Lemon yellow. That's really yellow. I don't think I've ever seen anyone that color, at least not on purpose. So if you notice this language. It said Chinese eyes are set like any European or American eyes. That's really interesting language, right? So they're comparing them directly to white folks. Okay, so this places now the Chinese in this weird situation where they're not Asian enough to be Japanese, but they're not white enough to be white either, but they're almost white, right? That's crazy. So just the language there is really interesting. And then you notice it says Japanese eyes are slanted towards his nose. I don't know how true that is. I've never really stared at a Japanese descended person before. It goes on, of course it goes on, to look at the feet of a Chinese and Japanese person. Now if you notice in one of the earlier images from early American history, we saw the image of Columbia standing over the Chinese man. He had on wooden shoes. So I don't know how true this is either. So this claim is that the Japanese feet are broken by their wooden shoes and that they have a much larger space between their toes while the Chinese don't. But the Chinese also wore those wooden sandals, so I'm not sure the disconnect there. And then of course broken English yet again. The idea that Japanese people cannot use the S sound or a recurring S sound. This second set was published in a 1941 edition of Life magazine. And you see that the author points out the major differences between Chinese and a Chinese national and a Japanese soldier, complete with facial symmetry, complete with dictating eye folds. You see this is a more frequent fold here and then a less frequent fold there. And look how this one is described as an earthy yellow complexion. Earthy yellow complexion.
So, this picture was right after the war started.
Yeah, this picture was right after the war started, December 1941. This is what the full page looked like. So this is the full page, the full 2 pages in Life magazine. Now Life magazine was a weekly magazine. Tens of thousands of Americans were subscribers to Life magazine. It was one of the more popular publications at the time. So lots of people saw this. All right. This is what the full page looked like. What I found most interesting about this is that they have an article here, but it's right next to a Zenith radio advertisement and a teething lotion advertisement as well. So it's kind of just jammed right into what you would typically see a magazine be, as if it were normal.
I'd rather have the whiskey.
Right. So what they're doing here, and people may not realize this, but what they're doing is that they're normalizing the idea that the Japanese are inherently inferior. Okay, they're normalizing it. They're normalizing it by sticking it in everything. They're sticking it in magazines right next to advertisements that people will look at and potentially buy. They're normalizing these ideas of racial inferiority within the American public. So let's take a step back and talk about why all this matters. So it's my job as a historian who happens to be fascinated with racial history to complicate our modern understanding of race. And I think I did that with the look of some of your faces. The way that historians do this is that we shed light on the historical roots of the system at which we strive to define who the other is. Okay? I hope that we've shown that race is a deeply complex issue. It goes much farther than just the color of someone's skin. In fact, one can argue that race has very little to do with the color of someone's skin, other than a surface level identifier. It appears, with this research, it appears that the vast majority of racial shifts in American history are centered directly on economic pressure, are centered directly on competing for jobs, they're centered directly on defining who the other is. And we know that there is no real biological difference between the different races, but the mechanism at which both the American and Nazi governments shifted racial identities during World War II is the same way that we shift racial identities today, using those same 3 techniques. Those 3 techniques have a long and deeply rooted history in American racial past, and it began centuries ago. We only talked about 18, 19, and 20, but you can go all the way back even farther than that. So we've got a few minutes left. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
We didn't kill all the Japanese, though. We didn't have a Holocaust.
We did not. That is true. It's impossible to. We should not We should not strive to compare the Holocaust to anything other than itself. But the globe has seen several ethnic genocides since then. The most recent, the one that's happening right now, are the Rohingya in Burma, right? The Burmese government have used these very same techniques. They define them as the other. They've created propaganda to say, we don't have any Rohingya here. You know, they have excluded them from society. They've stripped them of their citizenship. They're doing the same thing.
It's human nature.
It's human nature. You have to define who the other is. It's what makes you superior.
Good.
Any other questions? All right, guys, thank you.